Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. We have always been told how important a college education is in securing a quote-unquote good life for ourselves and our families. We have also been told that some schools are better than others, and obtaining a degree from one of those schools makes the chances of securing that good life even greater. So hence, the competition for getting admitted into these schools increases. It has also been argued that these elite schools only admit certain students, which by and large leave out Black and Latino students. Hence why race was included as a criteria that can be considered for admissions, in effect leveling the playing field until now. Recently, the United States Supreme Court decided that race can no longer be used as a criteria in deciding who a school admits. People have developed strong opinions on both sides of this issue, and today we will discuss, among other things, what the Supreme Court decision means to families planning on applying to college in the near future. To help shed some light on this issue and offer some suggestions on how students should approach the college application process in light of this decision, today we once again welcome Allen Koh, founder and CEO of Cardinal Education, an international admissions consulting firm based in California. Mr. Koh, welcome back to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be back.
Well, we are very pleased to have you back. I know the last time that you were on, we discussed more of a general stance on what students should or how students should approach the college admissions process. But I know today, in light of this new Supreme Court ruling, we're going to take a slightly different spin on it, but talking about some of the same things. But before we do get into that, the suggestions on strategies and things, for those of the listeners who may not be completely familiar with this issue, can you shed some light on what that recent Supreme Court decision was about?
Sure. So historically, American universities and colleges have been allowed to take into different demographic factors like ethnicity, race, socioeconomic background, just different aspects about you as a person, and they could factor that into whether to accept you or not. And so, especially for populations who historically have not had access to the highest quality education, they've made some concessions to have a rich diversity of students. So this has been the case now for decades, and just recently, in a pair of Supreme Court rulings against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the Supreme Court has decreed affirmative action is no longer allowed. And specifically, race-based considerations are no longer allowed when it comes to university admissions.
Now, of course, that is focused more on, like you said, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Harvard University are more of our top-tier colleges and universities in the country. But does this or can this ruling also have a trickle-down effect to some of our prep schools, the K-12 environment?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So there's no question that these rulings affect every university in this country. And in terms of prep schools, we don't anticipate them to be legally affected, but I think that we don't expect them to be legally affected. However, a lot of prep schools are very progressive. And so we actually don't expect prep schools to change their practices at all. If anything, we think prep schools might take these rulings into account to try to expand their social missions.
I think that's a really good, comforting thought to have for a lot of our families, because we know that a lot of people think that the proper track or a good track to getting into these elite colleges and universities is the prep school route. And so that I think that if they can get into those schools, they have a better chance of getting into one of those elite schools. So is that an actual good plan of action if families do want to get into these elite schools, to kind of try to get into that way through the prep school track?
Oh, absolutely. And there are so many prep schools and nonprofits in the New York City area, Long Island, and just all throughout the tri-state area that offer tremendous numbers of scholarships, even tutoring so that you can qualify for the entrance exams, all for free. So I would encourage anyone who dreams of going to a great university to think about prep schools. Don't worry about whether your parents can afford it or not. If you work hard enough and you're talented enough, these schools will recruit you and pay your way.
So now, if race will no longer be considered as a criteria for admissions, should students even bother checking off that box on their applications?
They should check off the box, but now, whereas in the past, checking off the box meant something, now checking the box is only a helpful piece of information that you should further explore in your essays. And so we think how students approach their essays should change as a result of these rulings in order to give themselves the best shot possible.
Well, I asked that question because I think some people may feel that, if race isn't going to be a consideration any longer, meaning that it's not going to help me get in, could it possibly be used against me? So that when somebody looks at my application and they see that I've checked off African American or Hispanic, that now that's going to be a strike against me as opposed to a plus for me? Well,
so in some cases, potentially is what I could say. So there's a lot of subtleties here. So for instance, if you are the child of African immigrants, right, you may have benefited from affirmative action in the past by checking a box. Now, you will not benefit by checking the box. You will actually have to explain about your unique circumstances. And if those circumstances are unique and compelling, then that is what universities would make their decision based upon.
So just going through the process a little bit more. Because we know that there are multiple criteria when it comes to the admissions process, and there's not really an exact science when we start doing these types of things. So what approach should students and families take when completing those applications? I know you started talking about how is all in how they fashion their essay, but what is the approach, I guess, that they should be thinking about when doing this application from top to bottom?
Sure. So some things to come out of these Supreme Court decisions. One, make sure your essays don't have privilege contained within them. That is going to be something that is looked down upon.
Can you explain that a little bit? What does that exactly mean? Especially, I mean, we're thinking from an African American or a Latino family who doesn't really experience privilege themselves. They're looking at privilege from the other side. What would that actually mean to those students to not to have or to focus on privilege in their essay?
Well, I mean, so sometimes students will really focus on what they might have versus what people, their relatives, family, friends, people they know don't have back where they're from, right? So if you focus just kind of on what you have and not what you've been doing with that privilege, that is not going to be looked upon well.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's
just, you don't want to have entitlement. You want to be very humble. That is always going to play well, but especially so now.
Okay. So again, it's like you said, it's not necessarily not that having things is a negative, but what have you done with those items, with the exceptions that you've been given? What have you done with those as opposed to just receiving them and not doing anything with them?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, I would say another piece of advice is for African American students who are more from an immigrant background, we think it's important for them to really emphasize how they're part of the American fabric. So emphasizing their immigrant experience and status, we don't think is going to be as effective as it used to be.
Now, I can hear a few of the our listeners now thinking, well, wait a minute. I'm a very proud internationality here. And now you're saying that in my essay, I have to ignore that and just focus on the American side of me and how I've kind of, quote unquote, assimilated into America in order to get into these schools?
I'm not saying you have to ignore it, all right? But if you think about what are the universities trying to do, right? So with affirmative action, they're really trying to not just bring diversity, right, for the sake of diversity, but people who've had really different experiences, right? And that contributes to a rich, like, kind of quilt, if you will, of a community, right? And so what the Supreme Court decision, what we think is there might have been a little bit more weight given to certain immigrant experiences over certain other immigrant experiences. And because that is going to go away, we think African American students, they shouldn't ignore part of who they are, but they should really embrace part of being African American and not just African immigrant, if that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. So I guess what we're looking at now is we're trying to really embrace, I guess, the whole idea, this whole melting pot idea. So if the United States is supposed to be this melting pot of all different cultures and backgrounds coming in and mixing in to become one completely new entity, that's what we should be embracing, as opposed to the individual pieces that go into it, almost like a salad bowl is. In a salad bowl, you can still pick out all the individual, you can pick out the carrots and the cucumbers and the tomatoes and all of that. In a melting pot, in a stew, not so much. Everything really blends into one another and it takes on a completely different flavor. So if we're really trying to embrace that melting pot idea, then I guess it makes more sense to focus on how you've become part of the melting pot as opposed to still maintaining that individuality.
I think that's right, because look, these are huge generalizations, by the way.
Of course.
So I don't think that this advice can apply to 100% of everybody. But what I would say is there's been a lot of questioning around, again, affirmative action policies were about addressing historical injustice and discrimination and leveling the playing field for people who have been deprived of opportunity. And so what the conversations that I've been hearing is that if you're an African immigrant, then you actually have not been deprived in the same way that somebody who has grown up, several generations in redlined areas and neighborhoods. So there's some controversy here. No one really cares about my opinion, so I'm just.
Well, no, we do that. That's why I have you. That's why I have you on the show, because we do care about your opinions, and because you're involved in this particular process on a more regular basis than most of us are. You kind of live and breathe this whole college admissions and even prep school admissions process, so you kind of know what the ins and outs are, either from a domestic student or even an international student. So, yeah, that's why. So we do value your opinion on this. But like you said, there's no magic bullet to all of this, like no one size fits all type of solution. But I think just having a bunch of different thoughts and ideas and strategies available is what's going to really help our listeners.
Yes. And so let me give you a really, I think, helpful piece of advice. And that is, a lot of times students, when they're applying to universities, they think universities don't want to hear about my problems. And, that's only half correct. Universities love kids who suffered through some sort of difficult circumstances and then worked really hard to hustle, be kind, figure out solutions. All right. And so they love stories about personal adversity and triumph. And it could be a small thing, right? It could be you're taking care of like your siblings, you go get a part-time job because one of your parents lost work. These are like kind of real moments of adversity and difficulty that some students face that they think are not worth telling colleges about. But that really speaks to a person's character, how they respond to challenges. And so for your listeners who've had challenges, who've done small things to really try to overcome and be a positive force in their family or their community, colleges want to hear about that.
And before we get to my next question, I just want to do a quick break for the moment and just say that you are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is Allen Koh, founder and CEO of international admissions consulting firm Cardinal Education. So now, let's just say you have the student who, for whatever reason, didn't have that adversity in their life. And I'm sure there are a few of those students out there who have pretty much lived life with the silver spoon and everything. They've been given everything that they want, every advantage that they've needed. What adversity are they going to write about in their essay? How are they going to make that essay stand out to the admissions counselor?
My first piece of advice is maybe they need to brainstorm with a family member or a teacher or a person of faith to try to brainstorm harder. Kevin, everyone has had some level of adversity. And so, unfortunately, and it's really important. I mean, if you think about a Disney fairy tale, it never starts off and they lived happily ever after. So any sort of college essay without some level of conflict is going to be considered a relatively boring and potentially not honest. And so really what universities want to know is like, what is your thought process? What is your mindset? Because many students have the same grades. Right. And so the measure of character is how you respond to challenge. And so I think people need to find out what the challenge is, right? Is it you're making your own meals because your parents are working? Is it you have a job? Is it you're taking care of siblings? You're taking care of a family member, right? Have you had financially tough times? If you've had relatives go through, close relatives go through problems with, the law, health issues, these are all hardships. And if you played a positive role in keeping your family together, keeping people motivated to make good decisions, all right, you're not curing cancer, but for a high school kid, these are really impressive things that universities would absolutely want to know about.
Now, let me ask you this for a minute, because I know, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but I'm sure that right after, or even now, because of the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of essays focused on that and how the pandemic may have adversely affected particular students. And I'm sure they wrote about that as their adversity, the thing that they had to overcome. Mm-hmm. Is it possible for colleges and admissions offices to kind of, here we go again, another pandemic story, and to think in those terms so that their story becomes just one of a bunch of other similar stories?
So unfortunately, the answer to that is yes. And I would say the more competitive the university, the more jaded admissions officers will be. And so if you think about it, a lot of successful people and unsuccessful people, they suffer the same adversity. But successful people will cite that adversity, right? Hey, here's what I did to overcome this. Whereas an unsuccessful person might say, hey, this adversity happened and that's why I'm in the spot that I'm in. And so I don't want to be unfair. I'm just trying to say that if you want better for yourself, then a competitive university will want to see that you've really acted upon that desire. So I guess I would ask people to look for mentors in your life and ask for help for trying to imagine how to break out of your current situation.
So it's not a matter of, okay, you don't necessarily have control over the adversity that comes into your life. And it may be people have shared experiences, but you don't have the same experience. The way it impacted you was not exactly the same as somebody else. Because we all went through the pandemic, but how it impacted you and how you reacted to it was different than the person sitting next to you or the other person across the country writing that essay. So that's where their focus needs to be, not necessarily on the pandemic per se, but what was my reaction to it and how did it make me better on the other end?
Yes. That's an inspiring story, not a sad story.
That's what's going to wow the, for lack of a better analogy, wow the admissions officer, because like I said, they're probably tired of seeing the same type of stories. But if they see something that is a little bit different, something that hits home a little bit easier, something that's more inspirational, that's what's going to really stand out to them.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned about getting more people to help you brainstorm and finding those mentors and so forth. Where can people go to find mentors or to even think about getting a consulting firm such as yours?
Sure. So, look, I think a lot of students don't recognize that teachers are people too. And you need not have a close relationship with a teacher before you might ask them for some advice. And it's not just the teachers you have, but there's so many people at school who are willing to lend an ear to any sort of problems or questions you may have. Principals, counselors, vice principals. There are a lot of people who will help if you just ask, right? So it's really about having the courage to ask for help, which sometimes is one of the scariest things. I also think that people of faith can really help. It doesn't matter what your religion is, but a lot of times there are people in the community of faith who are really in it for nothing but to just actually help people. And they can be a really objective person. And sometimes if you just meet successful people, you might have a favorite store you go to, right? Or maybe every now and then you go to the doctor and you might ask, for an email address. Hey, could I email you a quick question? How do you become a doctor? I don't know any doctors except for you. And so people are all too willing to help. But the biggest thing that you have to know is it actually takes a lot of courage to ask for help. A lot of young people are stuck on asking for help means you're weak. Actually, asking for help just means you're more serious about being successful.
And actually, that might be a good approach for an essay as well, to talk about the different mentors that you've sought out throughout your life because of particular moments of adversity or challenges that you faced. You went out and sought the help to overcome those challenges and so forth.
Wow, you could actually do my job. That would be spectacular.
Well, I mean, hey, from talking to you these couple of times, I've picked up a lot. But hiring a consulting firm, I mean, just it sounds expensive. So what would you tell families who think that getting or going to a consultant is something that it might be cost prohibitive?
Well, so the first thing I would suggest is do your research. The tri-state area has so much wealth that the number of scholarship foundations is actually mind-boggling. Right? I mean, the Prep for Prep is a New York program that is decades old, that is one of the models for many cities' top nonprofits to follow. And so these talent identification programs, they start with you in some cases in elementary school.
Yes.
And they will give you free tutoring that the rich people get for like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of your life. They'll give you a full scholarship to a great private school. So And you don't have to necessarily start in elementary school. Some programs start in middle school. Some programs, they start in high school. But there are a lot of consulting companies that are affiliated with these highly reputable nonprofit programs. So if you can't pay, but you feel like you're a hardworking person, find a scholarship program or a college access or a college success program. And that's your key.
Okay. Thank you. And what would be one of a couple of your biggest takeaways as far as that students should have, families should have? What would be a big takeaway for them in the whole college admissions process, especially in light of the fact that there's for all intents and purposes, affirmative action has been struck down. So what would be the biggest things, the biggest takeaways that you would give or advice that you would give to families today on how they should approach the college admissions process?
My biggest piece of advice, well, I've got several. One is ignore the rulings. They really don't affect that many people. All right. And whether it affects you or not, what will not change is the value of a college education. All right, especially if that degree is in a useful field like a science or engineering, or teaches you how to write and communicate really well. Those will never go out of style. And people think because of ChatGPT you won't need to learn how to write or communicate. You can actually wield these tools well if you're a strong communicator to begin with. So people should not be discouraged about university. It is still by far the best opportunity for a better future. And as tough as this country is, there's no country that gives better opportunities for people who want to make something of themselves. And education is really the only way to guarantee that.
Well, and I think that's why we have so many people from other countries coming here to get their educations, because of the different opportunities that do exist. I think there are over almost 4,000 schools, colleges, universities in this country. So the opportunities do exist, and they're a lot greater than they are in other parts of the world. But we would certainly like to thank our guest today, Allen Koh, founder and CEO of international admissions consulting firm Cardinal Education, for once again coming onto our show today.
Kevin, thank you so much for hosting me. Always a pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is definitely mine. And once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.